guys, welcome to Scott's Animal Adventures. Today I'm joined by Russ of Aquarimax Pets. Really great YouTuber. He's got a lot of following, a lot of information, and a lot of expertise to share. So as we get people coming in, we'll just do a bit of Russ's backstory. We'll cover a few sort of questions about how we've kind of progressed in the hobby, what made you go the directions that you went in, and your kind of catalysts for where you've sort of come to. So if we start off with, what sort of time did you start your invertebrate journey?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a good question. Well, I think I started as soon as I was walking because my mother did tell me I came home with a pocket full of live earthworms when I was 18 months old. So been doing it ever since. But I became a little bit more serious about it later on. When I was a teenager, I started breeding like aquatic crustaceans and, breeding feeder insects and things like that, about 13 years old. And then I spent some time abroad, took a little bit of a break, and then got back into it, when I was probably in my 20s, got more, keeping in those kinds of things. But I really got into invertebrates like isopods and so many other things a little bit more heavily back in, I would say, when was that? It'd be about 9 years ago or so. I started getting into bioactive enclosures and that kind of stuff. And that sort of caused the explosion, for me.
Yeah, obviously, a lot of Americans are only just getting into that now. So to be sort of 9 years previous and going into all of that good stuff, that's absolutely brilliant. Like, that's the kind of influencers we want to see, not necessarily, I've seen this bioactive thing, I'm going to do it for my channel, and then I'll maybe do an update. Like, it came before your YouTube really came along. Like, it was an interest before it was an influence, which is absolutely brilliant. So what would you say was your first bioactive setup? Was it for like a reptile? Was it just keeping sort of a small tank of different invertebrates to have different roles in the environment, or where did you really start?
Okay, well, I started with morning geckos.
Yeah.
When I lived in Hawaii, I couldn't keep much in Hawaii in terms of invertebrates or vertebrates as far as that goes, except for fish and birds. We were allowed to keep fish and birds in the apartment we lived in Hawaii for 3 years. And so I was keeping fish, I was keeping birds, and I've kept fish and birds and all kinds of things, mammals, whatever, for many years, in fact. And many people don't know that because my YouTube channel doesn't really reflect that so much now. But so I was focusing on that. But then when we came back, I started getting into morning geckos because in Hawaii we would see morning geckos. They would come into our house. We would see them out on the the trees and stuff like that. So I kind of, these are fascinating. I love these. I'd love to keep some. So when we got back to the mainland, I said, I'm going to find a breeder of morning geckos, and I found one and started doing my research and saying, okay, well, what can I do to make this a really interesting enclosure? And I had done a bit of research on bioactives before that, but that was my first attempt.
Yeah, so I mean, morning geckos are a brilliant species to kind of start that with because obviously their natural humidity requirements and the kind of setup you want them in, it really tailors to that bioactive because it would be so easy to implement the invertebrate cleanup crew, and it would also be extremely easy to add the live plants, etc., because you're not dealing with any extreme heats. You're dealing with a very manageable setup, and all they really need is a light cycle. So if you've got a decent enough light above, the plants will grow and thrive anyway. So yeah, I think that is an absolutely perfect start to a bioactive. I mean, my first one was my boa. So I got a Hog Island boa. I wanted to do things really properly, really well, and started seeing about bioactive and thought about the idea. And at first it was how can I reduce the maintenance so I can keep the setup looking tip top and keep an exquisite kind of display, and also reduce the stress on the animal by not having to completely destroy its home every time to clean it, etc.
Right.
So the thought of a bioactive really appealed to me then. And at the time, my mum said, "You're not bringing wood lice into this house. They'll go everywhere, blah, blah, blah." In the end, I just got the balls. I wanted to come and put them in and told her a couple of weeks later. And, now I keep 16 species of isopods, and I've got my own sort of small scale shop. Hi, Wally. As you can see,
Nice.
Stephanie put your link up, by the way. So that'd be really great. Everyone that does join or sees this after it's aired, please do go and subscribe to Russ. You'll absolutely love his content, and as you'll find out later, we will cover some of the really interesting insects that he's had the pleasure of not just keeping but also breeding. So that's going to be absolutely amazing to cover in a bit. So obviously, moving on from the bioactive, you were saying about you have a passion from as a young child. So obviously, being in the area where you were living in that, what kind of invertebrates would you sort of encounter sort of day to day that really piqued your interest and showed you what was really out there until you sort of got into the ability to get your own and sort of keep it as a proper pet?
Okay,
I think a lot of people, they kind of get those outdoor experiences before they bring it indoors.
Right, and I think that was true for me to a large extent. Really, almost everything fascinated me, but one species, or one, I should say a taxon, because there are many species, one taxon of insects that really appealed to me, still does, is the mantids. We have, of course, as in many other places, we have the Chinese mantis that are naturalized here, non-native species that now exist here in large numbers. And I've just found one the other day on my lawn. But the first time I found a couple of those in the wild, I was just astounded by how fascinating they were. So excited to bring them home and keep them. That, I think, was probably my first insect pet. I was probably around 10 years old when I did that. And I would bring home crickets, like the black field crickets, and try to keep them. And I loved how they would sing and things like that. Right around that time, too, I was keeping the anole, or anole, depending on how you pronounce it. Those were my first reptile pets. And I ended up breeding the house crickets to feed them at that time, which was not entirely on purpose, but I ended up doing that. And that I thought was fascinating too. So those were some of my first experiences. I also remember finding a pseudoscorpion in the wild and being fascinated by that. Finding a velvet ant in the wild and kind of teasing it a little bit too much, and I got stung by it all around the same time. I was about 10 years old, and it was pretty intense. And then, so I remember that one pretty clearly. Also a bombardier beetle. I remember finding a bombardier beetle and holding it right up to my face, and it ejected its noxious fumes right up my nose. So that was an exact... What was that?
I was unaware that the bombardiers were actually in the US.
Yeah.
I thought that was more sort of African, Asian kind of species in general.
Yeah, and there are some species here, and yeah, it was like a hot acrid steam going right up my nose. So that was memorable too. Not positive, but memorable. And I realized I didn't blame the insect. It was my fault. I was messing with this beetle, so that's why it did it. So it all just served to fuel my interest. So
basically, when the beetle shot you with the hot acrid liquid, it just kind of triggered something in your brain, and you're like, I just need to explore this world. Like, how can an insect do this to me? I want to know more. That's what I would have been like anyway.
Yeah, that's what it was like.
The velvet ad, I think I would have been a bit like, I'm never going near one of those again. But obviously not the case for you.
Right, right. I've always been fascinated by velvet ants, and now I keep them. So
Am I right in saying that the cow killer is a velvet ant?
yes, yes.
Yeah.
Cow killer is a common term given to especially the larger velvet ant species because their sting is so powerfully painful that people assume that a sting like that would be able to kill a cow. So that's apparently where the name came from.
Yeah. It's actually Stefan's birthday today, so obviously everyone wish the man himself a happy birthday. And after this, we will be on a live stream of sorts. Not anything invertebrate related as such, but more just absolutely destroying ourselves with chili related products. Seeing Stefan's username, he is obsessed with the spiders, like tarantulas and that, and the scovilles, which is obviously like chili sauce, anything that makes him cry. Um, yeah, we'll be doing that, I believe, either on Instagram or again on YouTube, sort of later on today.
Awesome. Well, happy birthday, Stefan. And I do enjoy some Scoville units myself.
Awesome. Well, if you look up Stefan.h2007, I believe is his username on Instagram, you'll be able to see some of the crazy stuff he's already got done. If you go over to his reels, you'll see he's done the League of Fire stuff, and they're quite brutal. But if we go back onto subject, I can imagine keeping velvet ants is something very, very foreign to the UK kind of invertebrate scene. I've not really seen them ever available, but they're absolutely incredible looking creatures. They're like a mix between a really colourful, fluffy, almost like a bumblebee, but then the body shape of an ant and the colours of a tarantula. It's like you took the tarantula like a brachypelma and you took the legs and then you stretched it over the body of an ant and then you made it bigger.
I like it. I think that's a pretty good description. Maybe one of the best descriptions I've heard of velvet ants so far. I like that. Yeah, they're fantastic, and a lot of people, they get confused about how exactly they fit in taxonomically because they are such an interesting mix. And just for those of you who might not know, velvet ants are not true ants. One way you can tell a true ant from a velvet ant is the shape of the antennae. An ant has kind of an elbow in the antenna. This is not showing up on the screen, but kind of there's a bend in the antenna in true ants when it comes kind of out of the head and then bends 90 degrees more or less angle. A velvet ant doesn't have those. And then, you think of ants being very social. They have, a eusocial system where different ages and different sexes and so on are participating in different tasks. And you have the caste like the queen, and you have the very small minims, and you have the soldiers and all these different things. Velvet ants don't have a complex social system because they're really not social at all. They're solitary. So they're basically parasitoids where they go around and find, in many cases, other wasps that are winged wasps that nest in the ground. And that's probably the most common host for velvet ants. They'll find either the larvae or the pupae of these other wasps and lay an egg there. And then that egg will, when it hatches, start devouring this larva or pupa and then turn into an adult. And the cycle starts again. The males have wings and fly around and look a lot more like a typical wasp, although in many cases they're also fuzzy. But then the females, unlike ants, which have a late stage where they have the wings when they first morph into an adult, they have the wings, they go on a nuptial flight and mate and then come back to the ground, generally lose the wings shortly thereafter. Velvet ant females never have them at all. Even when they first come out of the pupal case, they don't have any wings at all. So they're quite a bit different, but very fascinating creatures. The adults are nectivorous, so they eat nectar like bees and wasps, some wasps and things like that. So quite fascinating.
Yeah, and would you say that their kind of lifestyle is similar to like the solo wasps, because there are the genera of wasps like the tarantula killer wasp and stuff like those, where they will come along and they will lay an egg, destroy the host, and basically it's almost like Alien, like with the face huggers that come out of the stomach. They just eventually they'll just come out of their host. It's a similar sort of behavior. So they're good examples of that would be like the jeweled wasp and stuff like that. These really pretty animals that have completely terrifying ways of gestating their young.
Exactly. They're beautiful, but there's kind of a grisly story behind it, and that's true. Yeah, they do qualify as a wasp, and they're a type of solitary wasp that just happens to be wingless and incredibly fuzzy and beautiful. So yeah.
And of course, with the sort of analogy of them being ants, it's quite strange because they look more like bees and they behave more like wasps. So either call it I don't know, ground bee or something like that. Like that would fit more than a velvet ant. I suppose it depends whoever got there first and gave it that name that stuck.
Right. So the common name is actually not very accurate, but the velvet part is accurate, but the ant part isn't really. So if we called them velvet wasps, that would be more accurate, but nobody does.
And for anyone wondering, do you by any chance know the taxon scientific name for the genera?
Oh, yeah. There are a lot of genera out there. There are something like 8,000 species of velvet ant in the world. So
is that all in the US or?
No, they're spread out all over the world. There's even some in the UK. Not a whole lot of them, but there are some. Yeah, just a couple species. Yeah, I hope you're able to see one at some point. But the US has quite a few species. The hotbed of them, I'm actually going to visit very soon in the southwestern desert. That's where you'll find the most variety of species. And so next week I'm going to be out there and hopefully see some. I can catch them, in my yard, in my front yard, and backyard. They show up occasionally, but not in such numbers as you'll see in the further south where it's warmer. But they are, like I said, 8,000 species, and the family is the Mutilidae, or some people say Mutilidae or Mutilidae. It's Mutilidae. That is the family to which all true velvet ants belong, and the genus that I'm most familiar with and that I've worked with the most is Dasyamutilla, and it's a really full genus. Almost all the species that I've had come from that genus, so it's pretty large. And there are some really interesting things going on with that genus because a lot of the species look very similar to one another. Not all of them do, but a lot of species go with kind of an orange or red and black theme. And because they all look so similar, they participate in Mullerian mimicry, meaning they mimic each other, and any one of them is capable of stinging, and so it causes an unpleasant stimulus to any potential predator. And so any potential predator that eats one velvet ant of one species in that Mullerian mimicry ring will avoid all species in that group, and so it benefits them all.
Sorry. So would that be similar to something like a Parabuthus species and then having a less medically significant sort of copying it, but instead of it being that traditional way, it would be the same as 3 parabuthid species of scorpions. One is highly deadly, one is moderate and significant, and one is basically the same as a bee sting. So they all look pretty much identical, and obviously the most mildly venomous one of the lot gets the most benefit from the mimicry because everything stays away from it. Is that kind of what you mean?
It's kind of like that, except with velvet ants, at least in the Dasyamutilla genus, all of them pack a punch. I mean, it's not, no velvet ant that I'm aware of is medically significant to humans, but all of them have a nasty sting. You don't want to mess with it. So it's kind of like if you had all Parabuthus species and of scorpion, and any predator that messed with one would recognize, look at any other and say, oh, that's going to get me too, I'm going to leave it alone. Kind of like that. Yeah. They all have the same level of intense sting, more or less. I mean, there's going to be some differences because some of the Dasymatilids are, big, they're like 2.5 centimeters long. Some of them are, a quarter of that size. And so the size is going to make a difference and so on. But basically all of them have a sting that is intense enough that any attempt from any predator, they're going to remember it and they're going to avoid it.
Yeah, I mean, if anyone wants to see a velvet ant sting reaction, as much as it's a bit of a controversial channel in the general outlay, Coyote Peterson over at Brave Wilderness actually took a sting from a velvet ant, and obviously it might be over exaggerated compared to a typical person getting stung, but you can see like the mechanism and how that actually comes about. So anyone looking to sort of do some research, that is a good representation of what a sting would look like, B come along as. I mean, it's a very simulated situation, but you can't fault the guy for showing people not to pick this particular thing up, because this is what will happen for you.
Yeah, at least they know that it has that behind it, and it's an interesting thing, because one of my things that I like to point out to people is that velvet ants won't sting you unless you really mess with them. I mean, you have to make one angry. They are one of the least aggressive wasps that I have ever encountered. Or even defensive. They're not particularly defensive, and I think it has to do with a lot of things. And one of them is they know they can back it up. I mean, they know if something attacks them, they're very likely to come out on the winning end. Because first of all, people don't think of the velvet that they have, their very fuzziness, as being particularly defensive, maybe, besides the coloration. But on the scale of something small like a lizard or a bird or another invertebrate that tries to eat them, they're like little hedgehogs. They've got little spines all over them on that scale. So being eaten is going to be very difficult, even from that standpoint, even taking out the sting. And then their exoskeletons are very, very, partly because they don't have sutures where they have wings. Their thoracic part of their exoskeleton is very tough. And so you can step on many types of velvet ants, not all, but many of them have such a tough exoskeleton that you can step on one on a hard surface and then let go, and it would just bounce back and be totally fine. So they're very, very resistant to being damaged. And then they've got this sting, which is one of the longest stings for body size of any of the entire Hymenoptera group. So crazy long stings.
In terms of body length, if over exaggerated, if the body is that long, the sting is like that long at least. It's about a third to the body length. It's crazy when you see it come out.
Yeah, it's intensely long, and it is very, very painful, and most of the venom is dedicated toward causing pain rather than causing lasting damage. But
so would that be more of a cytotoxic response?
It probably is. It probably is. I've only researched the venom a little bit, but enough to know that, it's not causing any lasting damage. Like it's not a hemolytic toxin like some reptiles or something like that. It's going to cause an intense amount of pain. And I do remember, like I said, I was stung once as a kid. I have never been stung by any of my pet velvet ants, and I've kept them for years. Never been stung. Never even gotten close to getting stung, because you really, really have to make them mad. I mean, you have to bother them a lot.
You've got to touch some wood now just to make sure that you're not going to walk away from the video and do another one and get shot.
Yeah. Now, feeding the velvet ants, famous last words, and I have 5 stings down my arm.
So, a really great way to move on from that would be obviously their tank mates and the luck you've had with them. Stefan's going to absolutely love this segment because he's been wanting blue death vein beetles for literally ages. At least the last year, he's been checking all the sites, waiting for one to pop up at the right time so he could actually buy one. And to go further than that, you've actually managed to have breeding success, which is very, very rare in the hobby and in general with such a complex desert species. little do most people know that quite a lot of desert species, when it comes to breeding, actually rely on a very specific level of humidity below surface, a specific type of enclosure. Even like I can imagine that some of these species that people aren't breeding now, you could put them in a meter long tube that's a bit wide enough for them to make their burrow, and they go all the way down to the bottom, and you might get breeding from it. There's just not enough area for some of these creatures to actually explore their natural behaviors and have success.
Right.
And you've cracked the code with your blue death veining beetles moderately successfully, from what you were saying the other day.
Yeah, it's been fairly successful, and I think I always have to give credit to Dean Ryder, who was the first person that I know of who actually had them reproduce on purpose, and he's the one who's sequenced their genome. He's been researching the species for various reasons, and as part of that work, he was the one who kind of figured out how it works. And then what I did basically is, building on what he did, I wanted to first, can I replicate what he did? Can I make it work? And then once I did, which I have, I can replicate his results, pass it on, get it out into the hobby. And so we can have as many people breeding them as possible. And it's been working. I've had people contact me and said, I've watched your videos, I've followed it, and sometimes they'll ask me some follow-up questions like, this is what's happening, what should I do? And then they'll come back and say, look, here's my crop of beetles. I produced these, and I'm really excited about it. So I'll actually be making a follow-up video about that sometime soon. But yeah, these beetles are so fascinating because they're so hardy. You can keep them in a tank, and if you leave on vacation, go on holiday for a week or two, come back, and they're perfectly fine. Nothing you have to worry about. I mean, super hardy. Eat almost anything. They found that most of their food in the wild is actually dead, dried insects that they find in the desert. So they'll live in almost any situation. I think and live for years. I mean, they can live to be 17 years old, which is amazing.
Some people it's crazy to think that a pod can live that long. I mean, that's longer than most people can keep a bearded dragon alive in the hobby.
Right. And so it's a rarity. A lot of these beetles that you keep in the hobby, you have them as a larva for maybe a year. They turn into an adult, and you have them for 3 to 6 more months. And then if you don't breed them, that's the end of that.
Yeah, my neighbours are like that. They last 3 to 8 months or so. Very rarely a little bit longer than that. And then you just get all these little grubs, and you've got to go again. But I'm at the grub stage now, so I'm hoping that I've got the environment right for them to obviously come out of their oothecas and start the next generation. But it's my first experience with having that full cycle.
Mm-hmm.
That's interesting.
It is. It's a really fascinating cycle to watch. And I think part of the deal is that because blue death veining beetles are so easy to keep as adults and keep them alive for a long period of time, I think that's part of the reason. What was that?
The one thing that kills a blue death veining beetle, from what I've heard, is water and moisture.
Yeah.
If you go on holiday and spray it, you might come back with diminishing results. Whereas if you just treat it like it's just a tub of dirt and you leave, you'll probably be better off. It's one of those. It's like some plants, they just thrive on neglect. It's kind of like the insect equivalent of that.
Yeah, it is, because too much humidity, too much moisture, that'll do them in. And even that's true even of the larvae. I think when a lot of people set them up, they'll put them in a bone dry substrate with maybe an inch of fine sand, right? And usually what happens in that case, if they have male and female beetles, of course, or even a female that's been fertilized already, is that they'll get eggs, but they won't notice because either the eggs don't hatch, or when they do hatch, the larvae die because it's so dry. Because the adults and the larvae actually need different situation. They need different environment. And so basically, if you make a substrate that's deep enough so that you can have a dry surface, but some moisture trapped underneath, you have maybe
almost like when people get the straws, they get like the plastic tubes, they can fill up the water from the bottom up. That works really well for a lot of desert setups.
It does, and that's a great way to do it. Or you can put a well on one side and have a moist end and a dry end if your enclosure is big enough. There's a few different ways to do it, but you need to create that moisture gradient, and then the larvae will tend to do much better in a slightly moist soil or substrate like that with some organic material in it. So straight sand's not ideal. I mean, you can get them to reproduce in sand as long as they have food items. So people will bury carrots or potatoes or something like that under there, and that can work. Or if you mix some, I like to mix flake soil, make fermented oat, sawdust essentially under there, and put bits of wood and leaf litter and so on under the sand where they can get there. And as long as it is humid enough, then the larvae will grow, and I'll just go through and scoop out larvae from the substrate periodically. And you get a big enough larva, about 1.5 inches to 2 inches long. You don't want to get it really 2 inches, kind of pushing it, because you get it too big and they tend to die off. But just under 2 inches long, you get a larva like that. You put it in an incubator, so the temperature is 88 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm not sure what that is in Celsius. But
88 would be 27, I want to say. Ashley or Stefan, if you're in a chat, could you possibly just run a quick conversion and pop back in and let everyone know?
That's a good idea. It's a good idea. Way to figure that out. So it's converted. And I learned that from Dean Ryder. He said 88 degrees seems to be like the magic number. So it can work at lower temperatures. I mean, somewhere in the 80s can work, but about 88 seems to be, all of a sudden they start pupating a lot more frequently than at lower temperatures.
So
and then
like they might be buried deeper in the substrate, and then as they grow as larvae, they're working their way up. They hit this sweet spot, pupate, and then they come further up and hit the surface as beetles.
It could be.
That's kind of what I would be thinking in my head.
Yeah, that kind of makes some sense. And maybe they come up under a heated rock or something when they reach a certain stage. And, the sun-warmed rocks are going to be radiating that heat all day and most of the night. So it could be something like that. That makes a lot of sense. And then if you keep them at that temperature at about 75 to 80% relative humidity, that's key. You don't want to go higher than that. I remember my first group of larvae had this beautiful group of big larvae, and accidentally spiked my humidity up into the 90s and all died. So you got to be careful. You don't want to go too low. You don't want to go too high, but right around 75, 80% relative humidity. You keep them there, and within a couple of months, you're very likely to have some pupation. And once they pupate, it doesn't take that long for them to turn into an adult.
Would you say that in terms of somewhere like the UK, where you've got a bit more of a moderate average humidity throughout the year, would you say possibly looking at either a passive dehumidifier to bring the room level down slightly down towards that 50 range, or would you go further and possibly go for like a powered dehumidifier if you were really serious about it? Or would you just say, as long as you've got the ventilation right and everything like that, you should be fine, even at that sort of typically sort of 47 to 68% is like the UK range typically.
Well, that's a good question. Being, I'm in one of the
struggle so much over here.
And that's a good thing to think about. I think here I'm in one of the most arid states in the U.S. I'm in the top 5 most arid states. I don't have to think about dehumidifying a whole lot, but I would say that generally good ventilation, and then if really it helps to have a large enough enclosure so that you can do a little bit of a heat gradient, and put an overhead light over one side of the enclosure. I have mine in a 20-gallon long with a light on one side so that they have a temperature gradient, but also a humidity gradient, because the other side is where I moisten the substrate and whatnot. The other side, I never moisten the substrate, so they can pick. And if you're trying to do that in a little, people have these tiny little tubs they keep them in or whatever, which might be fine to keep a few adults and they thrive and live for years. But if you want to breed them, that humidity gradient is probably very important. And I would say keep an eye on the beetles. And if you notice that your beetles are that pale powdery blue, you're fine. Your humidity is fine. They're going to show up that way. If they start looking a little darker, if they stay darker and don't get to that pale blue, you probably do need to look into some methods for dehumidifying.
Hmm.
It's just not gonna. It's gonna be too moist.
Yeah, or even if you really wanted to go that bit further, if you feel like the room they are in is just not suitable, you could try another room in the house. So if you have them in the living room, maybe try them in a bedroom where it's higher up in the house, naturally warmer, naturally sort of a different environment.
Right, right. You could kind of make some changes in their microclimate, so to speak, that way, and that could be helpful. It does make a big difference sometimes, just upstairs, downstairs, or even higher in your bug room. You put it up near the higher shelves in your bug room can make a difference of several degrees.
And some people they go to the extreme of keeping certain invertebrates or even reptiles and that. I've heard of people keeping them in the bathroom because the natural humidity in the bathroom would be a lot higher, and so it's a lot less maintenance for them sometimes. Like especially when you're in a more arid state like yourself, if you was to keep a royal python or a boa or something like that, and you kept it in the bathroom, you might not have to mist it as much. And
True.
the thing with that is a lot of the steam that you get from a shower or stuff like that will be essentially like your distilled water. So there's nothing to worry about in that sense. You're not putting chemicals in the air the way that some people would think. And the only thing would be obviously the cleanliness of being near a facility. Um, but people have had quite good success with that. If you've got a very dry area and you struggle with the other rooms of your house, but you really want to keep something, get like a cheap humidity probe from Amazon or something like that, and just check what your bathroom sits at, because I guarantee you it will be higher, and it will be a more, because obviously there'll be tiled walls, so you'll get a natural humidity from that.
Right.
So where do
And
we want to go from here? What do you want to cover next?
let's see. So have we more or less covered the blue death finning beetles? I guess so. There might be some coming up in Q&A later. We can answer about that. We talked about velvet ants. Did you want to talk about some of the reptiles or some of the invertebrates still? Or
The reptiles would be brilliant, actually. So,
okay.
What would you say is your go-to reptile? Is it a lizard? Is it a snake?
Well, I've kept a few different types of reptiles. Pretty good number, I guess. I think for me, probably snakes are at the top, just because they're really easy in general in terms of maintenance compared to a lizard.
A lot cheaper as well.
What was that?
A lot cheaper as well. At least in the UK, live food can be quite an expensive thing to have, because if you're, for example, buying 5 tubs of live food a week for a medium-sized lizard compared to a moderately sized corn snake needing an XL mouse, which in the UK is about £1.30 for frozen food, and that's every 2 weeks. It really cuts down. I mean, my corn snake at the moment, I basically feed him sporadically between 2 to 3 week gaps, because I'm trying out a more natural food cycle. And where he's about 13 years old now, he doesn't need that growth maintenance level. He needs that slow down, don't make him fat in his old age kind of level.
Yes, exactly. And that's where our corn snake isn't quite that old, but he's old enough, about 3 years old, where his growth has slowed down, not stopped, of course, because they don't stop, but slowed down a lot, and is only eating about that often as well. And I love that. I love the fact that with snakes generally, every time they eat, they're going to defecate, and that's every twice a month. You only have to deal with that about twice a month, which is nice. And then you have many of the lizards have much higher metabolisms. They're eating a lot more often. You have to clean up after them more often. Of course, bioactive can help with that, but it doesn't eliminate the cleaning entirely. You still have to clean up. So there's
and if you're dealing with omnivores, you get the benefits of vegetables being included in the diet, which obviously when they come out of the other end can be quite smelly. Whereas snakes are usually, except for my hognose snake, I find that snakes are a lot easier to take care of, with that sort of stuff. Whereas
Yeah.
lizards can be quite brutal to the nostril.
Yes, that's true. And I think the lizards that we keep, I have mourning geckos from my original colony that I started, 8 or 9 years ago, whenever that was. And we've got a leopard gecko, we've got some crested geckos, and as far as lizards go, that's what we've got. And then with snakes, we do have our corn snake, like I mentioned, and I've been breeding red-sided garter snakes, which has been a fantastic, fun experience. I got a captive bred trio a couple of years ago, and then they just produced 21 babies this spring in May, and now I'm shipping out a big group of them today. After that, I'll only have a couple of the offspring left.
Yeah. For anyone that wants to see a really cool thing on the internet, type in a breeding ball of red-sided garter snakes, because it is crazy. You will get upwards of 30 animals all interbreeding in a massive, just mess of snake. And it happens for, I think it's a few days or a few weeks or so that they kind of occur, and then all of a sudden it's just all back to doing whatever. We've got Chris in the house. Hello.
Oh, yeah. Hey, there's Chris. Yeah, I recognize quite a few people here. So
history. So you started off with you're great, Chris, but you're not that great. We're talking about reptiles for now. So we've just discussed whether Russ prefers lizards or snakes. We've both agreed that snakes are the best. Sorry, Wally. So yeah, out of your corn snake and your garter snakes, would you say that your garters are more rewarding and sort of underrated compared to some of these other species that people keep? Because I would definitely say that.
I really love the garters. I mean, I love them both, and I love the fact that corn snakes are so chill. They just relax with you, and you can sit there and be reading a book or having a conversation, and snakes just kind of hanging out with you. I love that. As far as being interesting to watch in the cage or in the enclosure, and also interacting with, I think garters have corn snakes beat, because corn snakes will usually, they're in the enclosure and it's not food time, then they're not doing a whole lot generally. I mean, sometimes they get active, especially when it's getting close to feeding time, and you can tell they're looking at, is it going to be food time? But the garter snakes are constantly interested in what you're doing, whether or not it's time to feed them.
People don't give them enough space typically, because they think it's a smaller snake, it needs a smaller enclosure. But much like keeping a cobra versus a mamba, if you're talking about venomous snakes, they might be a similar size, but the cobra would be more comfortable in a smaller outlay because it's not a nomadic snake, whereas the garters, they're constantly up and down rivers looking for fish. They go actively fishing. It's just a completely different environment. And corn snakes are absolutely brilliant beginner snakes because they're so chilled. But if you want a display animal, much like your what would it be? Kind of like your arboreal snakes, a lot of the time they're a display animal. But even then, they won't really do much. They'll just perch on a branch, but they look beautiful. Garters are like puppy dogs.
Yes.
They're like the puppies of the snake world. And if you keep them communally, which very interestingly, they are kept very well communally quite often, then it's brilliant because you see the interactions with each other. One will put their head up behind a little leaf and that, and it's definitely a snake that I wish that I'd took more interest in when I was deciding my current animals. Because right now I've got a very angry hognose that hates my existence but loves getting fed, which is good because they're not always like that. Sometimes they just hate you. And then I've got my corn snake, which is an anoremorph So a lovely grey and black toned corn snake, which I still have yet to do a video on the setup because I've only just felt comfortable enough to really call it its final sort of stage. So I'll be doing a similar setup video to what I've done for the other two, and then obviously I've got my island boa, and downstairs I've got a bearded dragon. So really
Yeah,
great selection, but there's definitely more uncommon or underrated snakes that I wish I would have possibly looked into before making my final decisions.
that is a hard thing, and I think a lot of people feel that way because there's so much, and that's why everybody says do your research first. That's part of the reason. Part is to make sure you get the husbandry down and know what you're getting into and things like that, and that's very important. But also so that you know what you actually like and what you want to do, and like you say, all the things in your collection are wonderful, but you have to make decisions about how much you can keep, and you can't keep everything, and so it's good to think about those things. That's true. And I do think, like you said, garters are really underrated because they're so like puppy dogs. Like you said, I love keeping them communally. I have two males and a female that I keep communally, and it's fascinating to watch them interact. They do make their own little breeding balls. They're not nearly as big as but they'll go for 2 solid weeks and do almost nothing but try to mate this whole time. It's crazy. But so I may actually be getting a fall clutch because shortly after, about a month after she gave birth, they started trying to mate again. So we'll see. And didn't really give up for a while, so we'll see what happens. But yeah, I think they're great. One thing I'm considering doing in the future, actually, because I don't know. I want to be able to breed them when I want to breed them, but I don't necessarily want them to breed all the time. Up to 2 clutches a year or so. That could be too many, especially since red-sided garter snakes can have big litters of babies. Her first litter was 21, and she could easily have 30, 40 next time. So I think,
and overbreeding is definitely a problem with communal setups because unlike in the wild, you've got your respective mate 24/7. You're not looking for one. So, you could almost do it similar to how elephants are kept in zoos, where you have the bull in a solo tank and then a matriarch of females in a communal. And then that way you control breeding, but you also get the benefits of both keeping the fits.
Right. And so one thing I'm thinking of doing that I've seen some other keepers do is set up 2 garter snake enclosures, one just for males, because they do fantastic in a communal setup and actually, from what I understand, do better when kept communal. They don't require it per se, but they do better. Keep several males, maybe of different species or different morphs or whatever, and then do a female communal setup the same way. And then when I want to, I just decide, oh, go ahead.
That is a benefit of the same-sex communal, is you can have the benefit of snakes that are very social interspecially without having the risks of running hybrids like Snake Discovery had with Priya, who actually came to them, but it was a Prius, I think it was called, because they named it while being the hybrid car.
Yes.
And I think that was a red-sided with a checkered or something similar to that. If you kept that in a communal, then that's going to happen. Well, if you go same sex and you have like a fraternity and a maternity or whatever, then you can't really go wrong.
Right,
and
right.
You could almost have a separate breeding setup where you basically just go like, "Hi guys, this is your lovely hotel for the night. Enjoy yourselves, and see you in a few months."
Yeah, exactly. And that would be a way to make it easier to house a lot of, because in a 40-gallon enclosure for garter snakes, which is what I use for my trio, you can keep 3 or 4 in there pretty comfortably, and they have enough space because they're fairly small snakes, and they'll use all the room. I mean, I would love to give them a tank twice that big, and I'm sure they'd use all the room, but they do really well in there. And I think if I had, a couple of different species and maybe some higher end morphs at some point, some flames or some melanistic garters. Those are some of the ones that I really like. Then I could just say, okay, well, this spring, when everybody comes out of brumation, I'm going to pair the the melanistic male plains garter with the, or eastern garter with the female het melanistic eastern garter, and that's all. That's all I'm going to work with this year. And then next year, it's going to be the red-sided, and something like that. So I can make decisions on how I do that.
Yeah, because even if you just kept morphs together, although you're not going hybrid species, you would just have a lotto mix of what it makes. And if, for example, you stumbled across a kill gene, like in certain reptiles with not so much a kill gene as a definition, but spider ball pythons, etc. You'd have no control of that until you worked out what pairing was causing it and split that up and sort of went from square one again. So I definitely think that was a really brilliant idea. And for anyone looking to start up a communal, I would say definitely follow Ross's advice, because you've got your personal experience, but you've also got a really good head on your shoulders. You've got really good background knowledge and an interest in how the ecosystem and how the actual day-to-day running would work in certain situations. So you keep confident with it. We have got a question from Wally.
That's a great question. Okay, let's see. Opportunity to have a decent sized facility and a chunk of money. Gecko and isopod, another animal you would start first with. Okay. Wow, that sounds like my idea of heaven right there. That's pretty cool. There are so many cool geckos out there, and it's hard to. And I'm going to assume, because I have this facility and I have a chunk of money, that I don't have to worry about. I don't have to worry about how much it might cost at all. Okay, I'm going to go with that. And I'm just going to go out with the gecko and say I want the Nultinus geckos from New Zealand. I don't even know if you can get them right now, but they're super cool live-bearing geckos that live in the manuka bushes. I know, Wally, you know what those are, but they're beautiful green geckos with kind of varying white markings on them, for those of you who are not familiar with them. And I find them pretty fascinating and pretty unusual, so that would be fun. And last time I heard they were a couple of $1,000s each, something like that, and with a very low breeding rate. What was that?
They're native.
A native to New Zealand.
Okay.
Yeah.
I always was under the impression that Tuatara was the only native reptile to New Zealand. So I didn't actually know there was any geckos or anything else there other than the one mono species.
Oh, okay. And I think actually, though, the largest gecko ever in existence, which is now extinct apparently, is also from New Zealand. Bigger than Alicianus, in my understanding. And then let's see. So there's my gecko, an isopod. Probably one of the new Marulinellas, like the Marulinella tricolor or Marulinella Ember B or something like that, because those are hard to beat, pretty beautiful. And I've heard that a lot of them are pretty day active, which is fantastic. I don't have any Marulinellas at all, but I've heard that they're pretty day active. So I'd probably go in for something like that. Also very expensive and pretty hard to get still. And another animal you would start first with, I think it would probably be one of the, again, I'm not worrying about expense, probably one of the super dwarf reticulated pythons, one of the really dark morphs, because I love jet black snakes. And I think that would be, especially with the iridescence that shows up on them. So something like that.
Have you seen a Boland's python?
Yes. And they're absolutely...
The iridescent nose is incredible, along with white lips. Similar size to super dwarfs as well. I think if I was to decide between a super dwarf retic, a Boland's, or a white lip, I think I would definitely go for the white lip. personally.
Hmm.
The Bolans, if it was like a breeding project, because they're just such incredible snakes, and the Super Dwarf Retic, I think, although it's such a reasonable size, you've got a very, very, very nomadic snake. It's like your garter snakes, but on a
Hmm.
bigger scale. Like they are known for traveling island to island and all of this. They actually go via the sea and sort of, you know, although you've got your Karumpa and your Jayapura and stuff like that, you in the wild they would still make small coastal trips. You know, they've been observed. Even the full-size retics have been observed off the coast of Thailand. And
Hmm.
you imagine seeing one of them swimming down the beach towards you.
Yeah, so
That's pretty cool.
that's a good point. I've heard that the white-lipped pythons can be kind of uh, aggressive or defensive personality-wise. They'll
They're
take a.
very good defensive and they're very, very nervous.
Mhm.
They're a snake that you would benefit from a decent lineage of captive breeding before having a handleable. It's like your green tree pythons. If you got a wild caught one, it would light you up in a second. But when you look at the kind of long lineage captive bred ones, they're a lot more handleable and personable
Mhm.
because they've got that dilution of wild instinct.
Right, right, and then they
Quite
have the
looks.
experience. Okay, yeah, I have always been fascinated by any black snake. I really like the black milk snake too, and they're a decent sized snake. They get pretty big. They can get up to about 7 feet long, and they
Yeah,
go through.
Lamprocheltis nigricolor or something like that.
And let's see, and it's a subspecies too. It's
Yeah, it's Lamprocheltis.
I can't remember it right now. Darn it.
Gutella nigricolor, I believe.
That might be it. And they are so beautiful. They tend to be kind of relaxed. They're the kind of snake that'll come and crawl out on you when you open the enclosure, not because it wants food, just because it wants to come out. And like my garter snakes.
They're like a more accessible version of an Eastern Indigo. And then
Right,
obviously down further than that, you've got your Mexican black king snakes, which are like baby indigos. You know,
right,
you've got
right.
like one, then the other, then the dry marcon is just like the Ferrari. Any of the indigo and cribos, although they absolutely decimate their enclosures with fecal matter on a regular basis, they are worth it from what I've understood. And they are debatably some of the most intelligent snakes you'll ever run into. Um, the feeding response is insane. It's like a king snake on steroids. Do not put your hand in the enclosure before kind of giving them a minute to think, because you will get it.
You know, I used to work with an Eastern indigo snake. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to step on you there.
Sorry, it's just Chris just put the name up.
Oh, there it is. Okay. And yeah, I used to work with this Eastern indigo snake in the zoo when I worked in the zoo, and it was an absolutely fabulous experience. This individual was an older individual, was about 5 feet long, I think, just a massive black snake, but as very, very gentle. It was very relaxed, very gentle. I enjoyed working with it a lot, and it was one in the educational collection, so I would take it to presentations and whatnot that we would do, and just adored that snake. And I think that's actually part of the reason I decided to get into snakes later, because it was such a fabulous experience working with that Eastern indigo. And the other day I was down at Clint's Reptiles, and he had a black pine snake that was fantastic too. So that's another option for a black snake that a lot of people maybe don't think about.
Just to clear up my absolutely nonsense comment, I did mean the southern, I believe, the ones that are like the olive gold color on the body. But obviously, because I'm trying to listen to Russ, text on landscape modes and send it, it looks like I've had a night down the pub, so I do apologize for that. but I've not taken phone today because I didn't prepare enough. So yeah, in terms of snakes, have you ever felt intimidated by snake breeding as opposed to invertebrates? Because obviously, apart from your blue death veining beetles, a lot of invertebrates are pretty straightforward. Pair them together, leave them alone, babies come out.
Good question. I think a lot of the invertebrates I work with are incredibly easy to breed, and with snakes, since I've just started getting into snakes, maybe what has it been, 3 or 4 years ago that I've really kept snakes. I'm still kind of new at it, I feel like, and this is my first species of snake that I have bred, the red-sided garters. It's a lot of work.
I mean, luckily for you, they are oviviviparous, which means they gestate and carry the young until they are live birthed. So it's similar to how humans give birth. The only difference is they're non-placental, which is quite an interesting concept. So instead of being in a birthing sac, they have their own, I believe they're basically in eggs, and then the eggs dissolve shortly before they're birthed out, or something along those lines.
Right. So by the time they're born, they're basically in kind of a vestigial sort of egg sac, but there's not much left of it. And that's how it works exactly. And that does decomplicate things because the incubation process occurs within the adult, the female.
The animal is right. You get your incubation.
Right, and that part is easy. But as opposed to some other snakes, I think a lot of snakes, you're not keeping communally as adults and you're not keeping them communally as young. Garter snakes actually do better communally as young. And so I had my garters divided up most of the time as they were young. For a few days, I had them all, maybe one day I had them all together. But shortly thereafter, I separated them to groups and then had them sexed. A friend of mine, Don, of Don's Garter Snakes, helped me sex some of them, sex them all. And then I kept them separated into 3 groups. I had a female group, a male group, and then I had a group of females. They all happened to be females that were picky eaters. And so I had them separated into those groups. But because you should keep them communally, that has its own set of problems because they can fight over food. And so when you give them, garter snakes are born so small, especially species like red-sided, they tend to be really, really small when they're born. So there's no way they can swallow a pinky. I mean, there's absolutely no way. You get a corn snake the size of a pencil when it's born and when it hatches, and it can still handle a pinky. Most of them can handle a pinky. Garter snakes, no way. So you have to mince the pinkies.
You have a pinky or something like that normally for garters.
Yeah. You have to use tail. Right, and so with such a large group of them, I ended up mincing the pinkies. Got those herb scissors that Snake Discovery suggested, and minced the pinkies.
That's perfect because then you get a full prey item. You're not just giving them a bone and a bit of skin like the tail would be.
Right,
you're giving them organs as well, which is absolutely brilliant. It's when Don sexed, did he pop? Did he probe? What sort of method did he use?
He popped, and I do have a video of that if anybody wants to check it out, where I went to his facility and he popped them for me on the screen. And I didn't do all of them because 21 garters I get boring, but showed several males and several females. And he showed how to pop them. And he says with snakes that small, with tiny little garters, he doesn't probe them. It's just too dangerous. So popping's the safest with them when they're that small.
Because when you're manually putting something in, it's a lot easier, same as using a cotton bud, it's easier to perforate or damage internals rather than when you've got the experience and you know what you're doing, you've almost got calibrated fingers, haven't you? So it just becomes second nature once you've done it a few hundred times, like I imagine he's done it. It's just easy as anything, and you know that you're not going to hurt the snake.
Right, and he's been doing it since 1980, so he knows what he's doing. And so that was helpful.
The one thing that I don't really agree with is the fact that you can buy probes as a complete nobody on the internet. I feel like it should almost be like you go to a veterinarian, you have to have almost like a license to allow you to sex via program. And I know that that might be a bit of a controversial opinion, but it's such an easy thing to get wrong if you don't know when. Obviously, there's going to be a resistance, but if you don't recognize that as resistance, you've then punctured through the snake's organs.
Right. I think, yeah, you shouldn't do something like that unless you've had training by an experienced person. I agree. I think it's really something that
showing how to do it.
Yeah, someone show you how to do it, someone supervising you doing it after they've shown you how to do it, and then maybe you can do it on your own. But yeah, that's not something I would want to just tangle with on my own for sure. And what was the other thing I was going to say? Oh yeah, so the garter snakes, because they're communal, they do better communal. They actually eat better and grow better usually communally. So keeping them together is useful. But then, and you give them the minced finkies, because of if you give them pieces that are too big, one snake will grab one side, one snake will grab the other side, and you'll end up, one snake swallowing the other. So there's that. And I've had to separate a couple. In the beginning, I was putting in the minced pieces were even slightly too big because they're so tiny. And so at first I just had to watch them. And later on, they kind of get into it and you realize how small you have to mince the food. And so that's a little bit tricky because you're not just, popping a pinky into a tub and then going to the next one. So the food process, you have to watch them to make sure they're not eating each other. You have to do these things. And then I had a couple of problem eaters, which of course happens with other snakes too. Any snake, you get a big enough group of snakes and some of them are going to be problem eaters. But I ended up having to feed a couple of them on nothing but live Endler's live bearer fish for a while because they're a safe fish to feed them. They don't have the thiaminase that goldfish have in them.
Endlers are the guppies, aren't they?
They're very... Yeah, they're very closely related to guppies, and I have a big colony of those. And so I started feeding them those Endlers to get them eating, and then once they got them eating, I started them onto worms. So now they're eating both Endlers and earthworms, so their diet's a little bit more rounded. But those two still don't want to eat mice, but I found the perfect solution.
I'd say that that's a lot more natural for them, though, to be fair. Because in the wild, they wouldn't be taking the rodent prey very often at all.
When they're young, for sure.
Even on riverbanks, they would be getting these small fry fish and invertebrates and worms and that. And people don't realise that garter snakes would naturally have a mix of, invertebrates like crickets and stuff like that, as well as fish, as well as, your isopods. They've probably even taken isopods in the wild as babies, and then they move on as they get older and their diet changes with their size, because obviously then they can take the larger prey, so they might move on to small rodents and fish. But they are a species that does take a slightly insectivorous diet as young.
Definitely invertebrate heavy.
There's a ringneck snake in America, isn't there? And that is basically solely insectivore. Only eats bugs.
Yeah, the ringneck snake does tend to do that. And some of the snakes and there's another one that is found in my state too, is the variable ground snake. It eats things like centipedes and insects and whatnot, and that's almost its entire diet. With garter snakes, they've been known to take insects, but they can't really digest the chitin in them, so they don't get as much out of them when they do. So they tend to be right. They're not adapted, so they tend to take things like slugs and worms a little bit more. So definitely, invertebrates, but more of the slugs and worms, and also fish, tadpoles, that kind of stuff. And so that's a lot of their diet.
Obviously, I know that there's a snail-eating snake, but would a garter ever attempt to sort of go at a snail, do you reckon, in the wild?
That's a good question. I wonder about that myself. I'm not sure. I know they do like slugs, and I have garter snakes that live out in my backyard. Different species than the one I keep, but and they'll go after slugs. But I don't know about snails specifically, how they would handle the shell, if they would just kind of rip it out, or I'm not sure. A good question.
There's a snake that's basically fully adapted to process a snail from start to finish.
Hmm. I have read about that. Yeah.
Really interesting thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I also wonder about this because most of the northern and central U.S., because of the glaciation events that occurred thousands of years ago, didn't have earthworms there at all. We didn't have earthworms. We didn't have very many isopods either.
They wouldn't have got through the surface, would they?
What was that?
Even if they were subterranean, they wouldn't have got through the surface.
Yeah. There was basically these glaciation events scraped off so much of the soil that it was bare rock for long enough that it removed them, and then they didn't have a chance to, even when the soil gradually accumulated, they weren't there to colonize it. And so there weren't a lot of isopods, there weren't a lot of worms, and both of those, of course, are very abundant in those areas now because they've been introduced as Europeans came to the U.S. and brought soil with them, and so on. Those species came. So garter snakes, one of their main foods in the wild for many species is earthworms. But what were they eating before that? I mean, were they just eating more slugs and things like that, and more fish and frogs? And now they've kind of adapted to doing earthworms. It's kind of funny because there's some species that focus, very specific. Like in my state, we have two species of garter snake, basically. At least those are the ones that are most common. We have the wandering garter snake, and they'll eat worms and things like that. When they get older, they'll eat rodents, and they eat lizards and whatnot. And they tend to live both in drier areas as well as areas with creeks and ponds and whatnot. Then we have the valley garter snake that focuses on places where there's only frogs. You won't find valley garter snakes if there's not a frog population. And because it is an arid state, those are, fairly limited areas, but that's where you'll find them. And so they won't really exist in a place where there aren't frogs.
And people have said as well, with those kind of garter snakes, they will build up a natural toxicity inside themselves and become one of the very few species of snakes that are considered actually poisonous. And potentially, if the research is continued, I believe there's also some speculation that could be extremely, extremely mildly venomous.
Yes. That's true. There's the populations. There's certain populations, at least, of the California red-sided garter snakes, which are one of the most brilliantly naturally colored garter snakes without being a morph, just a wild locality. And these California garter snakes, some of them take a species of newt that has toxins. They sequester those toxins, which may be why they're so brightly colored, because they're aposematic coloration warning of the toxins. So they're poisonous. And then, like you said, garter snakes don't have any particularly dangerous venom for us, but they are arguably venomous. And that venom does seem to have paralytic effects on some of their prey. So one of the few snakes that can be both poisonous and venomous,
I mean, the other great thing about garter snakes, not that you'd ever eat one in captivity, but because they sequester it from their food, if they're not getting that food, they don't pose any risk. So if you was to handle them, or if you was to, for whatever reason, get bit or whatever, you wouldn't get the same effects. Obviously, if they do end up having a duodenose gland and the research is done and they are found to be mildly venomous, then they're mildly venomous. You can't avoid that. But much like cane toads and stuff like that, in captivity, they won't necessarily be as toxic or toxic at all, because they're not getting what they should be getting to make them at that level. So your dart frogs and that, in the wild, dart frogs can paralyze and potentially kill a man. You get them in captivity, and because all they eat is fruit flies, they're nowhere near as toxic, nowhere near as dangerous, perfectly safe pets.
Right.
And
people ask me about that all the time when they see my dart frogs, and they say, aren't those poisonous? And then I have to explain just what you just said. And then okay, I get it now.
You just start rubbing a tooth on their back, and the people just run away.
Yeah. One of the rules.
Would you like to find out?
One of the rules that my wife put forth as a request, whatever you want to call it. Early on, I think it was before we were even married, we were talking about things because I knew I would keep pets. And I said, well, what are things you just couldn't handle that you just don't want to keep? There's no way. And she said, well, no tarantulas, no roaches, and nothing medically significant. And I thought, that's fair. That's fair. I can work with that. And so that's what we've done.
As much as you would like a scorpion at some point.
And she lets me have, I have an Asian forest scorpion.
So win-win.
What was that?
You've got your pseudo scorpion, so I guess that's a semi-win.
And I do have pseudoscorpions. I also have an Asian forest scorpion because their venom's not significant. So the sting from a velvet ant would be worse in terms of pain than from a Asian forest scorpion. So as long as it's not medically significant, venomous is okay. But the nothing that send you to the hospital, definitely not.
Yeah, so like my assassin bugs, although they're not medically significant, it's still a bit on the hot side for what your wife would class as a comfortable pet.
Yes, that one is debatable. It's probably too close to the edge. I don't want to push it.
Yeah, I mean, people have likened them to as bad or worse than most, if not all, tarantula species. A lot of the scorpion species and research done into their venom, at least in certain species, has proven that they are not just cytotoxic, but they are also slightly neurotoxic. And they do have a systemic effect, like suppression of breathing and stuff like that in some severe cases. But obviously the species in the hobby, the most like slime. I think Chris and Wally are just joking around. I'm 100% sure. Wally's saying that Canadians crawl out from rocks, and Chris is saying about the ice and everything. Yeah, just to go back to that, the Platymeris species, the Bigotatus, the Laevicolis, which was formerly Rhadamanthus, those two are pretty much the hottest ones accepted in the hobby, I believe, at the moment. And they can give you a bad day, but I've got them. They don't seem particularly aggressive. They don't seem to pose much issue. As long as you take care and you treat them with respect, you're perfectly fine. That's with a lot of things. I mean, you could have the deadliest scorpion in the world, but as long as it can't climb smooth surfaces and you've got it in a deep enough enclosure and you've got it set up right, in theory, it's never a risk to you. But if you want to be that guy feeding your little baby scorpion with 2-foot-long metal tongs, then because that's the thing, a lot of people won't take that kind of precaution as much as it's worth it.
Yeah, and I think an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, they say. So that definitely makes sense.
It's like me target training a dwarf boa. Everyone's like, well, there's no point. But when you tap train a large constrictor, it doesn't matter what size it gets to, it installs that thought process. So you always know where you're standing with the snake. Same as if I put my hand in there right now, he would bite me because it is nighttime. His lights off. He doesn't. This is a no-go zone for me.
Right.
Whereas in the daytime, it's kind of like my time to interact. He's a lot more tolerant of me being in the enclosure. I could put my hand right up to his face, and he probably wouldn't even. I'd say bat an eyelid, but they can't obviously do that. But,
right.
But yeah, it's knowing what you're dealing with. And just to wrap up, obviously it's 9:18 now, which means it's 2:18 for you. We were aiming to be sort of finished by 1:30. So anyone in the chat, if you have any last minute questions, please do just spam Russ and we'll get through as many as possible. And then I think we'll call it and we'll try and arrange for something similar another day. Maybe we'll do a bit of a reversal and I'll pop onto Russ's channel, or if Chris or Wally have got the availability in that, I might be able to arrange with them. And we'll just keep us all in the loop. We're all friends here. It'd be really great to make a forum at some point and have multiple of us just having a similar style chat, sort of seeing what projects we've got on, try and get a really good viewer base and have a really good sort of time. Obviously I'm the most awkward one out of the group because I've got the biggest time difference, but we'll see what we can do.
I think that would be fun. Yeah, and I'd like to have you on my channel too. That'd be fun.
Thank you.
Both of those. Let's see. It looks like we are getting a couple of questions.
Yes.
Okay. Well,
From Ryan Thomas. Just a quick question. I'm about to get some Porcelio verneri and wanted to know your guys' take on their overall care. I don't have experience with them. I was in talks to possibly get my hands on some as well, but yeah, either yourself, Russ, if you've dealt with them, or I believe Wally's had some experience.
yeah, this may be one for Wally because I have not kept that species at all. I think they're fascinating. I think they're one of the most unusual isopods in terms of the way their color works. And so I like them a lot, but I don't have that species.
Yeah, I think your main bulk of experience is with the Armadillidium kind of species and the Ornatus. You seem to have quite a lot of experience with.
I do, and I do have a good number of Porcelio species, but I don't. There's quite a few species I can't keep just because of the way my permit works, and so I focused on a few. So I do have 3 different morphs of the Ornatus. I have Expansus, I have Magnificus. I have quite a few Scaber and Laevis, but only a few Scaber and some Laevis, but yeah, not all of them. Oh, here's another question. Okay, Wally's asking about the shows, vending at shows or thinking about it. I have not vended just myself at shows. I've worked tables at shows, in where there's somebody else who has a table and I help at the show. So I've done that. But I haven't had my own table where I'm the main person at the table, I guess. I've never done that. And I don't know. I think there are pluses and minuses to doing that. I feel like in the area that I'm in, a few years ago, 5 years ago or something, maybe a little longer than that ago, if I had sold all the isopods I had now, I probably would have done pretty well. But the fact is, because of the limitations I have with my permit and whatnot, there are not as many isopods. Like I wouldn't have the biggest selection at the show, right? I could have a lot of isopods, but wouldn't necessarily have the biggest selection at the show. So when I've sold at tables with other people working at their table and I bring some of my own isopods and sell them, I've had some pretty good success with that. But I don't know, because I feel like for all the work that goes into a show, and as much as I enjoy going to a show and interacting with people, I feel like as far as the amount of money I make for the amount of money I have to pay to get a table, that I might as well sell the same number of isopods and not have to pay table fees. And then, which I can do just at home by people emailing me and say, this is what I want, and then I go to the show and enjoy myself and go to all the tables and visit with different people rather than sitting behind a table the whole time.
So more social experience as well.
Yeah. Because when you sit behind the table, you're dealing with customers, which is great. You're dealing with people who come up to you and want to talk to you, which is also great. But you don't get to do the traveling and seeing the show. You hardly see the show at all. The last time I was at a table like that, helping out at a table, I got maybe 5 or 10 minutes to go around the show, and the rest of the time I was back behind the table. So,
who's that last one? Is that Chris? Is that someone else? Obviously, your one, Wally's one's up at the moment. So have we got any other questions? I've got a question for you. Just while we're seeing if anyone's going to come through.
mm-hmm.
But my question would be, if you took your permit past state border, do you then follow that state's rules, or does your permit cover you for your entire US vending? For example, if you were allowed to keep but not sell in one state, but then there was a show in another state where you could sell but not keep, or sell and keep, would you then be able to move your stock across? It kind of sounds a bit like drug smuggling, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, I think I do.
In one area but not the other.
Yeah, well, since I have to have a permit to receive isopods from out of state, and then I have to have another permit to send isopods out of state. And I think in both cases, I would have to I have different species on them. So I have more species on my permit that I'm able to receive than I do ones I'm able to send out. So just to give an example, I can ship Armadillidium vulgare to almost any state. But I can't ship Armadillidium gestroy, but I can receive it. So when I moved out of state, I would have to amend my permits before I do, which you can do. There's a permit amendation thing. Let's say I'm going to move to Texas, for example. Before I moved, I would have to amend my probably my receipt permit to receive them in Texas, so I can send them to myself. And then I would have to amend all my sending out ones to have an origin point in Texas. So I'd have to amend.
Other state shows, that would then be an extremely laborious process to get that all sorted, ready for your travel.
If I were going to move, yes. Now, right now, because I'm because I have a permit to move isopods from my state to most other states, not Hawaii and not Florida currently, but and with restrictions in some other states too. But generally, Hawaii and Florida are pretty much out for now. Florida, I'm still working on.
Basically like the Australia of the US. They don't let anything in, but they also don't want stuff going out because they protect their own native stuff.
Right, which makes sense. But if I were going to go to a show in Colorado, for example, right next to Colorado, now we're going to go to Colorado, because I have a permit to ship things to Colorado, I could fairly easily vend at a show. I would just have to bring permits, my Colorado permit, because I have a different permit for each state, right? So I'd take my Colorado permit with me as I moved across state lines. And then if anybody had any issues, I'd say, here's my permit.
And I suppose if you weren't allowed to, you could just send them all to Wally and then vend them at his booth.
There you go.
He's in Colorado, isn't he?
Yep. He's in what is he? Are you in Wisconsin, Wally?
Oh yeah, so. Wisconsin. Sorry, yeah.
But if I were going to Wisconsin, and I can legally ship quite a few to Wisconsin, so I could ship them to Wally, and then we could do something like that, so that can work. It is kind of a confusing business the way the permits work.
Yeah, I mean in the UK it's basically like if you can buy it at a pet shop, you can sell it. Mm-hmm. With reptiles and that, you obviously need to get your special courier companies that will basically take it to a facility, house it, feed it, send it out. Like there's like a handover period time kind of thing with a lot of the reptile couriers and stuff like that. But in terms of invertebrates, you can send them through the Royal Mail. It is frowned upon to send exotic invertebrates through the mail, more so tarantulas, etc. But then at the same time, it's live food in the UK. So because you send it as live food, you can send it. Huh. There's not a government stopping point. There's not like a customs or anything. So you send it. It's all marked up as live food. And it's okay. The only risk is if you send it for anything below special delivery, you're not covered for live food, I don't believe. And also you may only be covered up to a certain amount of value through certain postages, etc. But yeah, it's less regulated and it's a little bit naughty in the UK because obviously you're not sending a Monocentropus balfouri or something like that through the post to go and feed to a bearded dragon or something like that.
Right.
Ross's isopods mailed to me. They will get magically lost in the mail. Is that an inside joke?
Oh, I think he's just saying that if I ended up sending isopods to him to get to the show, they'd not end up in the show, they'd end up as his collection.
Nanette would be caring for them lovely, really well,
Yeah.
At least that would settle your mind a little bit. Like
that's true. If they're going to go somewhere,
Nanette rather than the Wally.
Yeah, Wally would do. Yeah, he's superb with his isopods, so I wouldn't have any worries about him.
Oh yeah, 100%. I mean, I really loved Wally's video earlier I caught it a bit late, but it was the one with the bioactive in his office.
Oh,
And,
I've been meaning to see that. I want to watch it.
yeah, it was really great. I mean, you've got him and Nanette basically making a bog standard bioactive that they can then use for videos on the different geckos. So it's not a residential tank; it's a tank of, you know, kind of like Clink's reptiles, where he's got his tank set up so he can just put a feature animal in, do a feature, and then move them back to where they normally live, etc.
Makes
The
sense.
thing I loved most was that him and Nanette actually synced up their outfits. So they were both in a red shirt like me and jeans.
Oh, cool.
The whole reason I chose the red shirt was so I could bring it up at some point. Yeah, the matching outfits were really great. So unfortunately, I think we're going to call it a night, guys. It's 9:30, which means it's 2:30 for Russ, and he does have some lovely animals to send out. So he needs to get a crack on and make sure that that's all done, and we don't want to rush it. So thanks for everyone popping in. I'm really sorry that you've only just got in, James. Have a really good one. Hopefully you'll catch this at another point, and we're going to call it a night. So I'm just going to play my outro, and then we'll cut off.
Okay.
So
Thank you, Scott.
thank you very much for popping on.